Yeah, thank you very much. And my special thanks go to Liisi, who invited me accidentally to this conference. I'm not a specialist in humorist studies. I just suddenly found in a second-hand bookshop this particular book, which I'm going to talk about. Be serious, my comrade. 256 jokes from the post-socialist countries published in Finland. One reminder before I start. With hindsight, I realized that socialist in the title is a misnomer, but if I would use dissenting or anti-socialist, these do not sound quite fitting either. Maybe you can suggest some better title to my paper. Maybe just jokes from the post-socialist countries in Finland. I don't know. Very ambiguous. As the pun Kekkoslovakia suggests, in certain respects, Finland resembled the socialist countries in the 1960s and 70s. In the heyday of internal and external Finlandization, official Finland had very friendly relations with the Soviet Union, so much so that the so-called unfriendly facts about it and the socialist system in general could be published there. And the people who offended this rule were reprimanded by the state authorities. President Kekkonen himself, he was in a hegemonic position, gearing Finnish foreign politics and cherishing friendship with Soviet leaders, Khrushchev in particular, and even made Lenin as the god or founding father of independence of Finland. In view of this, it may be somewhat amazing that the book containing jokes from the socialist countries could be published there. However, I have shown elsewhere that censorship didn't quite reach Finnish politically humorous columnists, cartoonists, or caricaturists. The editors of the collection of jokes, which I already showed to you, Be Serious, Comrade, Funny Stories or Jokes from the People's Democracies from the year 1965, enjoyed themselves in saying that jokes are so easy to smuggle across the Iron Curtain, nobody could stop them. As Christie Davies puts it, they sneaked around the prohibitions. This they did also in Finland, where they arrived in the minds of the travelers to Eastern Bloc or through the radio Yerevan. Nevertheless, the editors wisely made the gesture of mild self-censorship by using the term kasku, funny story, instead of vitsi, joke, in the title of the book, obviously because in Finnish, vitsi carries not only funny and ridiculing, but also denigrating connotations. Bored with the way the Soviet bloc had been black-painted in the West, these editors, wanted to give a say to the Eastern writers, journalists, and men of the street and let them tell how they themselves envisage their country and the socialist system. The editors openly confessed being envious of the high level of political humor in the East in comparison to its poor state in Finland, the land of seriousness. The large number, 265, jokes in the Ole Totinen toveri, tells us of the deep frustration of the people in the socialist system, to which relief was to be had by giving it vent through laughter and ridicule. Actually, they had the same function in Finland for those at the time who detested Kekkonen's so-called soft dictatorship. To me personally, they were an eye-opener to an unknown world. Davies has stated that in socialism, jokes related to distinctive social structures, being definitely political and most numerous, where the political control was most stringent. My approach is somewhat different. Inasmuch as the leaders of the socialist system shut themselves away from the society and their belief in the system and its paradisiacal goals departed from the social realities and became absurd, the jokes about the system reflected this estrangement and became more and more surreal and absurd. They reached a meta level from where nothing was sacred. In telling rather than analyzing them, I'm not a joke scientist or scholar, I will concentrate on three categories only. First, I will show the religious imagery used in the jokes and then deal with the jokes concerning travel and shortages, some 20 in all. Of course, this kind of telling, or how could I say, slight analysis, has its negative side too, as with poems, an analysis of jokes tends to make them commonplace or shallow. Jokes could not be ridiculous. One prominent group of jokes used religious biblical imagery, mainly when socialism could be somehow compared or juxtaposed with Christianity, showing that eradication of religious beliefs had not succeeded, or that socialist atheism and Christian belief system made a curious but useful mixture in the minds of ingenious comrades. Let's hear some of these. For example, it could be asked, what is the difference between revelation and miracle? The answer was, revelation happens when Jesus appears in front of the Politburo to solve economic problems, and a miracle happens when Politburo does something to do the same. Miracle happened also when a baby was born from a comradely marriage without any romantic love. In quite a few jokes, paradise and reality socialism were compared, and occasionally socialist scientists were claimed to have invented both earthly and heavenly paradises, reflecting the lack of fulfillment of everyday needs in the so-called real socialism. However, the highest stage of socialism was not quite like a paradise, although in one joke it had been reached when, I quote, people had got enough of everything, high up to their throats. Their situation, as the Hungarian slogan went, was hopeless but not very serious. In quite a few jokes there appears deep skepticism concerning the impact of socialist anti-Christian propaganda on people's minds. For example, Eliza comes home after her first day at school and her mother asks, "What did you learn there?" Eliza is lost in thought and finds the intriguing question, does God know that we do not believe in him? Inventiveness in concealing one's real beliefs seemed to have gone quite far too. One comrade had been seen through the keyhole crossing himself in the toilet. In front of the party committee, he explained, "At first, I had to straighten my cockade, then check my party badge on the right pocket, then my party membership on the left, and finally I buttoned my trousers." There were also jokes which combined the main themes such as religion as space race. I mean travel, showing hesitancy and secretive attitude. Khrushchev interviews Gagarin. "Tell me, comrade, did you see any white-winged creatures up there?" Gagarin says, "I did see them." Khrushchev, "I felt this, promise me not to tell anybody else." Then the Archbishop of Moscow puts the same question to Gagarin. Gagarin answers, "No, I didn't." Archbishop retorts, "This is what I suggested, you should not tell anybody else." Hell and devil were prominent in jokes. Hell resembling socialism, torture, and robot, and devil in various roles, the dictator. Once devil appeared as an asylum seeker in heaven because Stalin had been admitted to hell. And once he turned away from a visit to heaven because he was told the road there leads to socialism. After Stalin died, it was debated in the Politburo whether he should be buried in the Soviet Union at all. The Politburo had received an offer from Israel, but some had protested. I have heard that somebody had once resurrected there. Lenin appeared in the collection only once, maybe because he was respected so much. He was admitted to a test period in heaven, And when God asked St. Peter to report about his progress, St. Peter answered, "He has done very well, my comrade." In another talk, Peter gave one wish to Kennedy, Khrushchev and Gomulka each. Kennedy, let atom bomb destroy the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, let atom bomb destroy the United States. Gomulka, but now I would like to have a cup of coffee. And the socialist hell was certainly softer than the capitalist one, because in the socialist one there was continuous lack of tools. All right, the other group, if you are not bored, there were many jokes about the space conquest. When the Russians lost the Sputnik in 1957, two Hungarians discussed, and one wondered whether they soon reached the moon. And the other asked hopefully, all of them. One joke nicely combined the topic of space conquest and travel. Estonian Communist Party leader optimistically declares, in 1967 we will send one man to the moon, and in 1974 one to Mars. One commoner humbly asked, when can we go to Helsinki? We know that some 200,000 Hungarians had escaped in 1956 after the so-called uprising or revolution. I don't know how the Hungarians nowadays call it. They were followed by one lucky dog, from whom his Austrian fellow inquired, why did you do it? Was your house in bad condition? Were there enough bones to be eaten? The Hungarian dog answers, my house is winterproof and there are plenty of bones but to eat, but I wanted to bark too. At home, Imre, the Hungarian name, in Imre's defection was discussed in a party meeting, and his action was severely criticized by one comrade. However, self-criticism followed. Why didn't I follow him? Imre's comrade had been brought to mental hospital. He had tried to defect to Soviet Union. The most adventurous defector came from Montenegro. He had climbed to a high mountain top and was ready to jump down. His comrade wondered, what are you going to do? The fellow explained, I just learned that the world is spinning around. I'll jump when the United States is underneath. Vain hopes, perhaps. Shortages. In spite of the so-called fridge socialism, at least in Hungary in the 60s and 70s, shortages and complaints about them became part of everyday life in socialist bloc. This was humorously reflected in jokes. Here I cite a few of them, starting with the ones which bore on imperialist international relations. In one joke, it was concluded by an economist. Basically, the difference between socialism and capitalism is economic. In capitalism, people exploit others. In socialism, it is the opposite. In the shadow of economic competition between the West and East, Kennedy once informed Khrushchev that the Yankees had decided to build socialism in their country. Khrushchev was not particularly delighted. Oh shit, where we can buy wheat then? It had been wondered by him how USA and Canada can produce so much grain, and he realized why. It was typical capitalist overproduction. In another joke, a foreign minister from a developing country begs from the Soviet ambassador, maybe in Tanzania, I don't know where actually, could you please send to us something that helps us in our famine? Not only tons of political literature and socialist advertisements. A new shipment was duly sent, full of cookbooks. So there were ingenious, or how they call it, incongruous ways to go around the shortages or transform them into something different without eliminating them. For example, one comrade complained that although in the radio it was announced that large amounts of meat, milk and butter, this is from Hungary I think, had been produced, but his fridge remained still empty. His friend had a solution at hand. Connect the fridge to the radio. Other inventions could help too. If cow and giraffe could be interbred, benefits would accrue. The giraffe part of the new animal could eat from the neighbor's side of the field, and the cow part would produce milk on one's own field. And reminding us the day and where recycling recycling and reuse of products actually began. In socialism, drunkards, people who drank a lot, could buy liquor with the money they got from selling empty bottles. This is the usual what happens nowadays in Finland. Okay, conclusion. What did the socialist jokes mean to the reading Finnish public? By way of conclusion, one can make 3 points. First, they showed to them that everything was not as good and people were not as happy there as was depicted by the leftist propaganda and romanticist images of socialist reality in Finnish communist socialist magazines. For instance, Maailma and ja Me, World and Me magazine was very popular in Finland. They showed how the so-called unfriendly facts in a roundabout way. There was another reality there than we Finns imagined to be there. Secondly, the Finns realized that socialist jokes were clever and ingenious and enriched the rather poor gallery of jokes in Finland, which consisted mostly of jokes about spendthrift Latvians or homo and homosexual Swedish. Thirdly, they gave some ammunition to the opposition to the Kekkonen's official Finland, where self-censorship in dealings with the Eastern Bloc should have been applied. However, that opposition was quite insignificant in Finnish politics in the 60s. Anyhow, the pure fact that such a collection of jokes could be published in Finland demonstrates that freedom of expression somehow worked there. Thank you very much. Okay.
So if not, maybe we could discuss it after all three presentations. Maybe we'll come back to the
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So the aim of this presentation is first to describe the Estonian joke tales, first of all, about clergy, and to position them within the framework of Christie Davies's theory of jokes and targets. And secondly, maybe also as a side topic, to discuss these clergy-related jokes in the context of collecting and archiving and researching joke tales in general in the Soviet times, for example. The presentation is inspired by two scholars who have greatly does this work with this? No. Who have greatly influenced, these are the ones, my thinking, and indeed have caused my entering the field of humor studies in the first place. They are Arvo Krikman and Christie Davies. It was Christie's article in the 1977 book edited by Chapman and Foote, It's a Funny Thing, Humor. I found it in a well-hidden shelf in the Tartu University library when browsing through books I could use for my first seminar work at the university, which was about the psychology of aggression. And I still remember my astonishment, and I delved into this book and read article after article, and it was really inspiring. And next year, when writing my bachelor's thesis in psychology, I tracked down the closest ethnic humor around the world. It was in Helsinki. And I traveled there to read it, because then it wasn't so easy to get books. It wasn't online. And I couldn't take the book home from this Suomen kirjallisuuden seura SKS library, so I just stayed there. Also because I had no money to make copies, it was just too much. And I didn't want to go back where I stayed because I actually camped in one of the parks in Helsinki. So I just stayed in the library and read the book And I was really amazed at the elegance of the center-periphery model that he described there, and how it allowed to draw connections with the Estonian old joke tales, first and foremost. And after having graduated, and there were some other things in between, I got a sudden phone call from Arvo Krikman. And he asked, I didn't know him before personally, and he called me and he asked if I would be willing to write a grant application together with him in order to study Estonian Jokelore. He was fascinated by the internet jokes. He just had discovered this for himself, and he just wanted someone to study the richness of the material, to study it with him. And also the parallels with the older layers that he knew so well. So he needed, he felt something needs to be done about this internet material quickly. I agreed, of course, on the condition that I could focus on ethnic jokes, which he allowed, of course. He had actually a photocopied version of ethnic humor around the world in his office, so I didn't have to travel to Helsinki anymore to read it. I just could sit in the office and read it. And he was also wondering about the same things connected to ethnic jokes, so it all worked out fine. So we compiled the database. He collected the internet jokes for some time. He had collected them for some time. I made arrangement with the more popular joke sites for them to give the material that they had so far, and this joke database came together quite smoothly. But working with the earlier material, as I found out, wasn't as easy as that. There were card files in the Estonian Literary Museum, in the Estonian Folklore Archives, in a heap of uncategorized papers as well, and field notes and materials from the 1880s forward. And only little work had been done with that material. An attempt to get a general idea and overview of these card files shows that the things are not so well with them. There is a vast richness of the archives, but it's not readily available for researchers at all. Texts are written down from these said papers very sporadically. And some things have been written down several times, some haven't been written into the card files, copied into the card files at all. But some work has been done, however, with the clergy jokes, as I will soon show. And anyway, collecting jokes or joke tales wasn't among the first tasks when this folklore collecting campaign started to grow and be popular in Estonia. So joke tales wasn't the first choice of those correspondents who sent in folk songs mostly and other genres. In terms of genres, it is perhaps important to, these were the books. And this was the database. So in terms of the genres, it is perhaps important to say that peasant landlord jokes were numerous, but not as numerous as clergy jokes. And this landlord theme or topic was much more common in folk songs and proverbs or legends. Why is that? So maybe landlords were an unquestionable authority, a status of non-negotiable power, and they were also distant. They were not visible in everyday life of a peasant. And clergy, however, was something Christie Davies would have seen as a monopoly without competition, perhaps. Much like Soviet jokes about Soviet leaders, it was also a social group that was supposed to be about the mind, as religion is a way to take care of one's soul and spiritual well-being, not the material well-being. And in the jokes, instead, they proved to be much more bodily than expected. So the big gap between the idea and reality was something that made the joke tales prosper. So the few people who did turn any attention on joke tales were, first of all, Mattias Johan Eisen. He was also among the first folk collectors who became interested in folk jokes among other genres. He did notice the frequent occurrence of clergy jokes in the material, but he didn't publish them in any. He did publish popular collections of folk jokes, but he didn't publish any clergy jokes belonging to that group himself. So he was a pastor. Sorry, my slides are out of synchronization. So this is one of Eisen's publications of folk jokes. So he did publish them, but mostly they were on like daily topics or the life cycle, followed the life cycle of peasants. This was one of the few ones I could find that somehow touched on the clergy. Rudolf Põldmäe, another person in the 1930s, a folklorist who did become interested in jokes. He founded this card file, started copying out the jokes from the material so far, but well, his work was halted by the onset of the Second World War. So he, one example from the card file that he had put together, again somehow touches upon the topic. It is mentioned that there is a parson there involved, but it's not really highlighted perhaps. It is maybe more about intramarrital relationship. Loreida Raudsepp was probably the one why I'm doing this presentation also, because she very diligently copied the clergy-related joke tales from the older archive. And it was because this was one topic that could be studied in the Soviet times. She started in the end of 1950s, and her research was really supported. Her topic was really supported by the power, let's say, the authorities. So she published the registry of anti-clergy joke tales. It was translated. It was published in German. It was a 1969 book. And she also found Latvian, Russian, and Finnish parallels to the joke tales that she was describing or putting into the register. And altogether, she had 427 types of those clergy jokes. So as you can see, this is what it looks like. It's not a very interesting reading. Over 3,000 versions of jokes. But this is why this section of old joke tales is relatively well documented. It is something that Arvo called an oasis in what otherwise is a desert of ignorance and barren area. So he also appreciated her efforts in that. And a bit later on, but also in the 60s, I would say, Selma Lätt also worked on this topic. Together with Raudsepp, she published a popular collection of jokes about the clergy and categorized the book into categories like Parsons' personal negative characteristics like evilness, greediness, stinginess, gluttony, drinking, playing cards, stealing, just general oddness. Other church servants like the sexton and the bell ringer, church services like weddings and funerals and so on. Raudsepp underlined or stressed another important category, which is the parsons' poor command of the Estonian language. They were usually Germans or Baltic Germans. They didn't speak the language too well, or did so with an awful accent. So that was also a frequent topic of these jokes. That was what her edition of the book looked like. It was quite thick and full of concentrated, focused on the jokes about the clergy, and also had a lot of caricatures, illustrations inside of it. What to make of it? I will try to use this data to illustrate how Christie's models of joke target choice work, and hoping also at the same time providing a novel angle of looking at anti-clergy joke tales in terms of collecting and archiving them. You can find maybe, inspired by this mind versus matter, mind versus body model, three kinds of jokes in the material. First of all, when the parson could be clever, but somehow his mind fails or gets tricked by people, by children in this case. When they try to use their mind to make something better, but it doesn't really work the way they want to. In this case, trying to use the mill for making butter. Secondly, parson can be just portrayed as a fool, sometimes who suffers because of the stupidity. So in a way, no mind to speak of. Many of the jokes here are somehow about the inability to speak the local language. So taevas on the abimees versus teivas on the habemees. This is just a small difference perhaps, but important for the congregation. When a parson accidentally takes along an empty sheet when going to give the sermon, and has to be rather brief because of this. There are a lot of jokes about all kinds of fake sermons or accidents that happen during the sermon service. Finally, the parson as a body in a way, as just a physical force. So church as slavery, or parson as greedy or gluttonous, or embezzler, or doesn't care for religion only for its formal benefits or side benefits. Like this one, where he puts in, says 1 ruble 25 instead of 1.25. So showing that he often has to deal with money and different monetary interactions. Or this one, here he just is ridiculed, I guess. Doesn't really have to, it has to do maybe a bit about him being obsessed with dinner or eating, there is something there behind that. But another example about a story of a parson interested in earthly pleasures. And this is a very frequent image as well, where the parson sitting on a pig being dragged along by a pig. and thinking that the pig is a devil. This is a very common motive. So Selma Lett writes that, underlines that Parson is one of the most popular characters in folk jokes. He was the master of church land and houses, which made his relations with the peasants hierarchical. So he was depicted as an exploiter and slave driver in a way. And going to the church, for example, was commonly called slavery to God or serfdom to the church. So there were parallels with landlords and clergy anyway, they're present there, to stress the non-voluntary character of it all. And Parson was anyway seen as the estate owner's, landowner's right hand in cultivating humility, in cultivating obedience among peasants. So he was like a tool in the landlord's hands. And Parson very often did that with the help of both psychological as well as physical chastisement, which is also important with regard to Davies's observations about body and mind. He uses both of those. He threatened them with torture of hell, but it also showed them hell on earth with a whip or just by beating them, which is a motive in those joke tales as well. So jokes about Estonian clergy, they provide quite a complicated example. They make use of numerous specific stereotypes besides the general universal stupidity, which would lead to the idea of no mind or the prevalence of matter over mind. And although Davies states that his models cannot be used to explain other kinds of jokes, but only stupidity jokes, it might not seem to be the case here. I think it fits quite well to these clergy jokes. Just a few notes on clergy jokes being used as Soviet propaganda. This is a poster for an atheist meeting from the 1957 at Tallinn University, actually. It was on the walls. The clergy jokes carry a specific message in the context of the Soviet time, which is why Lett and Raudsepp could study them. It was one subject that wasn't subject to censorship when it came to jokes. So it allowed for the official pretext of publishing and studying. It was the message that it conveyed already. The peasants knew that the clergy cannot be trusted, that they had attained their power unfairly, and that the joke tellers already knew that at that time. So it became part of anti-clerical propaganda, which was especially severe in the 50s until the 70s at least. Well, yes, this is another example of this the serfdom of the church, or person who is carrying the cross. Christie Davies's models, or the unifying ideas behind them, came from his vast knowledge of jokes and his close exposure to data. By looking at what the targets have in common, he started from his center over periphery model, and then moved or shifted to monopoly versus competition model, and then mind over matter model. These, of course, are complementary. They cover slightly different areas, but in a way have a more generalizing power, perhaps, behind them. In terms of center over periphery model, I think this doesn't work too well when we are looking at the clergy jokes in Estonia. It does work well with some ethnic targets, as I already saw when I was doing work on the ethnic jokes. in Estonia, the islanders, for example, are the frequent targets of ethnic jokes, especially the older folk joke tales, older folk jokes. In the case of clergy, the monopoly over and competition model does a better job of explaining what goes on there, but well, the clergy gained its power through rather aggressive conquering, and from then on it was seen by the local peasants as a monopoly. Like the estate owners control the material world of the peasant, the clergy controls the spiritual world. So on the whole, it can be said, and I quote from Jokes and Targets, they enjoy automatic social power that hasn't had to be achieved in competition with others. But the mind over matter model is something that maybe interests me most in this data, or shows the best fit in a way. Also in Jokes and Targets, Christie Davies writes, behind the way jokes fit the mind over matter model lie the prestige given particularly in the past to those who dealt with the pure world of the spiritual, the elevated and the abstract over the useful and practical. Clergy's work-related ambitions were not very tangible or practical, although the magic aspect of, for example, baptizing was certainly embraced by the peasants. But side by side with the mental world, the clergy dealt with matter, the land, the church building itself, and the money the peasants were supposed to give them. So humor arises from the perception of the social ambiguity and contradiction, and also the gap between how we experience the social world and what we are told it is, what the clergy is supposed to do, and what it is in fact. And perhaps also there existed a ban of pointing that gap out, which also gives like a push to jokes. And also this incongruity related to an important aspect of the jokers' lives. They were in daily contact with the clergy. And the clergy were laughed at because of their mundane and at times disgraceful habits that shows them as a body when they should be a mind instead. According to Christie's model, the body overcomes the mind and becomes dominant. Bodily instincts and wishes of the parsons and sextons and whoever were the other people dealing with the church matters show that they are not much different and nothing human is alien for them, and they are not what they are actually preaching or imagine they should be. Christie writes, again in Jokes and Targets, in a good Popperian spirit, the new mind over matter theory seeks to cover all kinds of stupidity jokes about groups and also to cast some light on jokes about the stupidity jokes about groups and also cast light on jokes about the canny. Its strength lies in its comprehensiveness, but how secure the theory is will depend on how far it can successfully accommodate further examples about stupid groups. I think this clergy jokes shows that the theory doesn't apply only for the examples described in Jokes and Targets, and maybe not only about stupidity jokes either, but also, again, quoting different occupations, classes, and ethnic groups that he also hinted at, but didn't yet maybe explicate or show in detail how it works. So in case of this predominantly German clergy in Estonia, it has a lot of parallels, or has this power or as a good fit with the model. Regardless of these numerous additional aspects or special stereotypes like gluttony or the trickster element in the sexton that often appears in jokes, the clergy jokes, joke tales can be explained with the mind over matter model and the way that jokes become a welcome element in anti-clerical propaganda in the 1950s and 1960s. This belongs to the secondary usage of folklore and constitutes another important and fascinating example of how folklore and, well, jokelore works within the society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now time for questions. Yes.
So people were kind of fighting against clergy with this humor joke, right?
We're fighting against
Against clergy.
clergy, yes.
Are you aware of any jokes this clergy fight against ISHS or non-believers?
Yes, that's an interesting question. I haven't run into such jokes, so maybe it hasn't reached the archives, or I haven't reached so deep into the archives to find such jokes. I think, well, Eisen lived in a different time, but it could have been something that circulates in a special group, like, for example, the group that Johan Matthias Eisen represented, or the clergy themselves. So it would be a place to go and look for it. But at the moment, I have to say I don't know if there are such examples.
I know Christie found a whole lot of jokes about Scots clergy, and particularly books that the clergy themselves have written. There seemed to be a sort of spate of people in the early 1900s, and I didn't know to what extent this turns up in the things you read, because I think you discovered it rather late. A whole wealth of treasure trove of these books that have been written by Scottish divines. Now, one of the themes that comes up is the sort of conflict between the strict Calvinist and the not so observant. Do you get any of that? And are your clergy all Lutherans, are they?
Yes.
Yes. So you don't have arguments about doctrine, predestination.
No, it doesn't get so complicated. No, it is rather the jokes that the peasants made about the clergy as such, as a kind of unified category for them, representing an alien group that came with the, yes.
No, there's this one, just bear with me, where the person goes round to the parson's house, and he's very, very drunk, he's banging on the door. I want to talk to you about predestination. Go away, Sandy, you're drunk. Yes, but when I'm sober, I don't care about predestination.
Well, they are about a social group, yes. They are not, no, I wouldn't, yes, I would rather say that the authors or the circulators of these jokes just, well, had fun on, yes, they targeted a social group that was, yes. They didn't really delve into the religious detail behind it or anything. That wasn't of interest.
Would you say it's largely a continuation of the pan-European medieval tradition of jokes against the comparatively privileged clergy? And the target is, as Linda was saying, it's not so much the religious belief, it's the hypocritical gap between
Yes.
the way the lifestyle
Yes.
should be and the way the lifestyle is.
Yes, exactly. Yes, I agree.
Why we have jokes about veneration of creed. Exactly.
It's not about religion there. Yeah. Okay.
No, thank you very
Thank you.
much once again.
All right, good afternoon. I'm going to talk about early Titanic jokes and in general the type of jokes that are referred to as disaster jokes. This is something that Christie Davies has done for the Christie Davies panel here. This is something that he was really interested in, and he offered an explanation about what's going on here. I heard this for the first time at the Krakow workshop at the Humor Conference, where he had a series of workshops. So after that, I invited him to Brno to come for a lecture series, and he kindly agreed, and he gave a week's long course on language and humor, which was attended by lots of students and was hugely popular, because you can imagine that students on the BA cycle learned such things such as phonology, front and back vowels, sibilants, and all of these things. And then comes Christie, and he says phonology and jokes, right? How are different varieties of English, what role they play in jokes. So until today, colleagues and students tell me that was a good choice of topics. Okay, now one of the things that Christie said during his workshops was specifically that there were no jokes about the Titanic disaster at the time of the disaster. And this felt somehow strange to me. It was bugging me. So I went on a search, and my aim, the aim of the talk today here, is basically give you the findings of this search and maybe offer some kind of explanations of what I make out of this with respect to the theory of disaster jokes. Right? I'm going to focus on Czech humor from the 1910s, and I'll also mention some forms of contemporary Titanic humor that is modern. And as I said, the aim is to reflect and perhaps somewhat rethink the theory about what's going on here with these disasters. Now, disaster jokes are classified as a category of dark or sick humor. Right? As Giselinde Kuipers says, there is the incongruity is poised between the gruesome and the innocuous. Right? Sick humor, as we saw, as we heard yesterday, for instance, deals with taboo topics. Right? It's well beyond the limits of decency. It's beyond the mainstream morality. And it deals with the transgression of norms. So people laugh at other people's suffering and death. Now, disaster jokes have been associated with such events as assassinations, accidents, terrorist attacks, natural catastrophes, all events that result in this gruesome loss of life. As Ellis, in his article on the 9/11 attacks, said, predicting what disaster jokes would look like, writing this text shortly after the events happened, right? He refers to a media disaster, and he says that there was some initial period of humorlessness when people don't joke, the nation may close shows, humor shows, and so on. But after some time, the status of the event changes from the present to the past, so there is some kind of a mental adjustment that can give rise to some joking, right? Large mediatized disasters have been explained in terms of the humor theory as being based, or the emergence of the jokes based on the disconnection between the event and the larger audiences out there that are not directly affected by the disaster. So this is about the shock over the actual events, which becomes necessarily intertwined with resentment over the way in which we learn about them. Right? So it's about the mechanism of learning about these events, the argument goes, rather than the events themselves. A number of disaster jokes and joke cycles have been studied. Christie suggested that probably the 1963 assassination of John F. Kennedy was the first one. And on it goes with Challenger, Chernobyl, all the way until the present. Right, maybe it might be worth not to talk about disaster jokes, but rather disaster humor, right? What obviously started off with the verbal folklore, the canned joke genre, has developed through email and computer-mediated communication into different kinds of humor about the suffering, say. And what we see nowadays, with the social media and the memification of communication, that we're not really talking about jokes, but certain humorous acts that are motivated and associated with disasters. And this humor, of course, has certain socio-pragmatic functions, right? Now, let me give some examples of disaster jokes here from Davies, right? For instance, these one-liners referring to the tragic death of Princess Diana in 1997 that he collected and mentioned in his writings. Or this one, right? I think they're almost notorious in the community. Now, at some place, he says, on the one hand, we have these authentic jokes, but we also have synthetic products of, say, TV comedians who reflect on these disasters and incorporate references in their own performances. And he says these can be recognized. They are not so natural. Right? He gives this example from Jay Leno's show about O.J. Simpson. Right, the African-American football player who killed his wife in the mid-1990s. Right, that's the idea of the race card there. Okay, now the most important thing here, I think, for this talk here is the argument that disaster jokes are actually conditioned by television. Right? Davies says, they are about a distant calamity or the sudden demise of a celebrity, and they are important new subset of sick jokes, which only emerged, and this is his emphasis, and flourished after the rise of television to become the dominant mass media in the 1960s. At another point, he mentions that this is a theory, this is a suggestion, that is falsifiable. And he says the most telling evidence is the fact that such jokes did not exist before television. And this makes my version of the thesis falsifiable. And then he refers to this famous case from the 1930s about the killing of the vicar of Stiffy, and says if somebody brings me a whole sheaf of these jokes, then we'll have to start again and look at this. When Davies came to Brno, I I listened to his lecture. I went home ruminating, saying, there must be an early Titanic joke, right? It just must be somewhere, right? So I went into the online archives of Czech humorist newspapers, and I spent the night working through the volumes and the material until I found something, right? And the next day, I was taking Christie on a tour of South Moravia. We visited some Jewish cemeteries and the wine-growing region, and we hopped across the former Iron Curtain into Austria and back. And we were sitting in this restaurant, and there I asked him, so what happens to the theory if you find a counterexample? And he came to this position that we have to do something about that, right? So I gave him the examples, and he seemed very, very intrigued by that, right? Now, he says that there are no Titanic jokes before actually the 1997 movie, right? A modern pop cultural phenomenon. Right, this is, for instance, a joke that references this pop cultural phenomenon. So if you want to quickly read it on your own. Of course, what we see here is that it is a joke in which Titanic features, but essentially this is a racist joke, right? It plays on this person's color, right? Right, current Titanic jokes, appear in other situations. For instance, this is a joke that's classified as Jewish, as an instance of Jewish humor, right? A Jewish joke, because it's about Jewish personalities, even though, you know, the Titanic issue features in there, right? So these are the jokes that are around there in the modern times, right? So what I looked into was two sources. First, the writing of Jaroslav Hašek, a favorite of Christie Davies. He loved his The Good Soldier Švejk, and one of the latest articles that he wrote was on the Poles in Švejk, right, in the book. He called it a politically incorrect comic masterpiece. Hašek was just 39 years old when he died. And apart from this groundbreaking, really strong work, he wrote 1,200 short stories, right, submitted to periodical publications and newspapers, right? So this was sort of a revelation to me as well, that he must have been like, it was a pot boiler for him, right? So I went into the archives, and the second source was the journalistic, the humorist magazine called the Humorist Times, Humoristické listy, which was a pictorial weekly published between 1859 until 1941, printed in Czech. And I searched the online archives, but it's not a full-text search, so you have to go and read every issue, right? So I did this for the 1912 and 1913, doing this qualitative analysis, seeing if this topic appeared somewhere in there, right? This was a magazine published in Czech, dealing exclusively with humor, and Bohemia, or the Czech lands, were a part of Austria at that time. The situation was bilingual, so there were also German publications here, such as Fliegende Blätter. I looked into the online archives of that as well, but didn't find any relevant instance. Titanic was discussed, but it was commemorated, but it was not the subject of humor there. So what I found in Hašek is actually an anecdote. This is from a letter that he sort of wrote to the editor of a newspaper. I'll read this quickly. I could tell you, my editor friend, about the disaster of the Titanic, but you may have read it in the Pravo little newspaper, where the chaplain Josef Ptáček explained the matter to a girl from the 5th grade of the basic school in Hostivice. He said that two big ships made a bet about which one would get to America first. One of them hit an iceberg and sank because they, the passengers, were not praying on its board throughout the voyage. They did so only when the ship was sinking, but God punished them. It was too late and of no use to them, and they all drowned. I also have an opinion on this matter. The iceberg prayed, and so nothing happened to it. Personally, I know another case illustrative of what mild religious feelings can lead to, and he goes on to describe a football match where a goal is scored and the goalie screams, and right, we get this same idea. So this is his criticism of the Catholic Church, of the clergy, right, where he inserts a reference about the Titanic, right, to make his point about the absurdity. And he does this 2 weeks after the sinking of the ship, right? Which shows a number of things. This phenomenon must have been already a part of the cultural literacy of the group, right? They must have been very familiar with this reference in order for him to capitalize on it in this kind of humorous text, right? And it's also illustrative of the way Hašek develops his humor, right? It's an anecdote, and then he tops it, and then he adds another one. So it's sort of an incremental construction of absurdity on an absurdity. Okay, now the second example here, actually I found these three examples, and they represent three different genres: an anecdote, and a joke, right? So there's the clipping here, and you can read it for yourselves. A couple of points about this joke is it's not particularly well formed, I mean, this is from 100 years ago. Lots of those jokes are somehow, not very fortunate. They play with some humorous idea, but they don't have strong punchlines. And this one overdevelops and over-explains that, right? So there's some kind of a disharmony in terms of the joke model. But it also, the point, the fun, or the issue that it refers to is, of course, the riches of the people who were on board of the Titanic, right? The material losses which were suffered, and all of those went down to the bottom of the sea, right? So just imagine the situation, the common people, they read about it in the newspapers, these huge, lavish riches, the richest people, in America and so on, traveling here, and down it goes, right? So it's that. This is the idea which they're playing in this joke. Right. The third one that we have here is actually a cartoon, right? So I was fortunate that they don't have a full text search, because I wouldn't be able to find it. So what we see here is the Titanic in the background, sailing across the ocean. We see icebergs. There's a boat with two guys coming up to this person sitting on an iceberg with a strange box in his hands. Now, this will make sense once we look at the caption, right? Hey man, what are you doing on that iceberg? The people in the boat say. And this person is identified as a photographer for a biograph. I'm waiting for some other new disaster. With that Titanic, we missed the chance to make quite some money, all right? So then I went and looked into newspapers of the time to see, how they covered this. And funnily enough, I came across this. It was called a feuilleton, right? It's called Before the Catastrophe, where you have a German, an Englishman, a Russian, and an American on board of the Titanic, and they're sailing on the maiden voyage, and they're discussing the music, how great it is. The Russian says, we have nothing like that in Russia. The German admires the technical features. The American says, we will rule the world, and he shows his egoism. They discuss current politics, they discuss trust legislation, they discuss the ship, and then they hit the iceberg. The Russian is then concerned about the women and the children. They should be saved. The Englishman refuses to acknowledge the situation. He just sits and smokes his cigar and says, this ship is unsinkable. This ship is unsinkable, right? And the American jumps up, takes a pistol and says, I need to get into the boats, right? And that's where it ends. I'm not saying this is an instance of humor. There is potentially something humorous for us in this, knowing how they used these national stereotypes, which may be with us still 100 years later on, of course. But this sort of resembles the three-nation jokes, right? An Englishman, Frenchman, and Irishman are somewhere, right? And something happens. So I'm wondering, if this is some kind of proto-humor or some potential proto-humor. Just to give you an idea about the timeline, the Titanic timeline in 1912, right? On the 14th of April at 23:40, right, 20 minutes before midnight, they hit the iceberg, right? The next day, early in the morning, the Carpathia ship comes and saves the passengers. Just like today, the last bus saved the previous one when there was this accident, it started burning, it was like the Titanic. So on the 15th, the ship sinks. Carpathia sends a cable to Newfoundland, it goes to New York, and all it goes around the world. The news is spread, right? Only 3 days later on, we get this feuilleton about the four nationalities in the Lidové noviny in Czech, in the middle of Europe, in the Czech language, right? 13 days after that, we have Hašek's anecdote. So he's already making fun of this thing, or using it for his purposes, not making fun of the disaster as such, but he's using it to make fun of the clergy, right? That should be made specific here. And then the cartoon comes, 15 days, 17 days after that, and in June we get a full joke, right? A canned joke on the Titanic. So we do have the contemporary jokes or humor that centers around this disaster, right? It is there, and it's something that actually went into the print, so it's preserved, right? The question is, are 3 or 4 instances enough, right? This is not really an international joke cycle. It's not a cycle. These are isolated occurrences. The Titanic, has a marginal presence, you could say, in these jokes. But, the question is, this got into the print, so how much how much joking could have been there at that time that was not preserved, that we don't know about, right? I think these jokes or these instances of humor are simply proofs that people did joke about the disaster, right? And they contributed to this humorist newspaper or journal, and it was printed. And these may have been the jokes, that were considered by the editor as within the limits. We don't know. Maybe there was something that was beyond the limits. Right, that more like resembled actual disaster jokes that we associate with JFK or that we had about Diana. So why should there be these jokes about the Titanic, right? This was the biggest, the most luxurious ship at that time. This was the Concorde of its period. It was hailed as the safest, but then bang, down it goes on its maiden voyage, right? So there is the size of the tragedy. That is very, very strong. There is the fact that this was the first thing, right? This was labeled as the biggest catastrophe the world has ever seen. This is taken from Lidovanov in a newspaper. And in fact, the Titanic is a failure of an icon of modernity, right? I would say. So the Titanic is sort of a metaphor on the existence of the limits of the technological process, right? Bigger, stronger, unsinkable. But there we go, right? Humans versus nature, So the Titanic here could be seen from a humorous perspective, at that time as an epic fail, right? Despite the tragic, outcome of 1,500 people dying instantly, right? Some open questions on the data, perhaps, was Central Europe more predisposed to the emergence of early Titanic humor? So, because of some kind of cognitive distance, Bohemia is a landlocked country, it doesn't have the sea, nobody has ever seen an ocean liner before, right? So it doesn't touch you so much as, maybe Belgians, Dutch people, And of course the Brits and the Americans who were involved in that heavily, it's also a different language, It's purely in the imagination, the ocean, the iceberg, and the ship. Or, thus perhaps Central Europe has a different joking culture, maybe more irrelevant, dark humor, maybe more counter-authority, as Hašek exemplifies. Well, we would have to see if there actually were not other instances of this type of humor in the other cultures. We simply do not have the material from elsewhere at this point, I think. So we can't make these statements, but maybe it's all somehow interrelated. Anyway, so let me discuss the findings here. Davies says there are no contemporary jokes about pre-television disasters, and they are truly a product of the electronic world, where he says, the internet facilitates the circulation and so on. It's not clear in some of his writings whether he means joke cycles that have to be global and relatively fixed pattern, quickly spreading, or just disaster jokes, right? So these two issues may need to be teased apart. Of course, we may, start thinking about including other jokes, other kinds of humor, not just canned jokes with disaster themes in terms of this theory. But definitely, the televisual presentation is not crucial for the emergence of disaster jokes, I would argue here. Right? And the disaster jokes can appear within days after a disaster, right? And they appear on the other side of the world, as we see, right? 6,000 kilometers I'm wondering, you know, what to do with the disaster joke theory, whether some maybe modification or some maybe rethinking might be wanted or needed. First, we could say that the theory works only partially, right? That television is nothing but a recent form of mediatization of the disaster, right? So let's forget about the visual aspect, right? That scholars have mentioned, right? We don't need the visual images in our living room and be, you know, like being morally indignant by what the media are telling us, how we should feel about it, right? So I think there's this over-privileging of televisual technology that we might want to question a little bit. Other news media, of course, can serve this function of news provision. Print news, the telegraph, right? The yellow press, right? And also, you know, the mainstream newspapers. For instance, 3 days after the disaster, you know, the Lidové Noviny has a full-blown page of information about this culled from different sources, New York, London, Frankfurt, Berlin, you know, and that talking about the investigations that are going on in London against the company. They're talking about the riches, the celebrities who were on board. It's all there. And you get graphic descriptions of the suffering, of the scenes, already before Carpathia comes into New York, because it's been wired, right, across the world. So disaster humor can still, if we uphold that position, be a counter-discourse to news providers. Now, the second possible, you know, conclusion here might be the theory does not actually work fully, right? Why should the disconnect between the event and the people be needed? You know, after all, cynicism is a part of human nature. You know, it's part of people to laugh at other people's suffering. So it's a natural phenomenon, right? So even in the absence of television, you know, something happens, we may expect there will be people who will laugh at it, right? Who will turn it into a joke, despite the imminence of the suffering, right? Okay, I'll conclude with that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Searching for very rare species of fish.
Oh, yeah.
I want to go back to the article I wrote on disaster, which was the Challenger jokes, and which Christie actually extended, maybe overextended, in talking about television. What I suggested in that thing on the Challenger jokes was that, first of all, there were joke cycles. So it wasn't that there was just a joke. A lot of people were telling jokes. The second point I made is that these jokes were important because they could not be reported by the media. In other words, because they were black humor, because they dealt with gruesome images and stuff like that, they couldn't be directly reported. And some even articles that acknowledged them said, I can't repeat them here, which I think was a lot of the point.
Yeah.
The third aspect was, it was a reaction, not only, it was a reaction of the over-sentimentalization of the disaster, and the unwillingness of the press, who would print pictures of the fireball and show the video, to actually describe it in terms of what was actually happening to human beings. So now Christie extended that by saying this could only happen, you know, this happens when you get television, and I think he's right only to a certain extent. No, I think it's a media phenomenon, but not necessarily only the television media. And so what you don't have in your examples is, one, good examples of folk joking about the disaster of the Titanic, because unless some folklorists collected them back then, you're stuck looking at the media, which is the problem. Second, what changed between the Titanic and the Challenger and some other disasters is that sentimentality died as a legitimate kind of public expression in many venues. Okay? We became modern. We mocked Victorian sentimentalities. And yet when the newspapers expressed these sentimentalities, the folk did not go along with it. And consequently, you have this joking, which was a reaction to that kind of sentimentality. And so to some extent, Christie is right that, that television fabulously extends, it brings tragedy into everybody's home, whether they want it or not. And often they do want it, but whether they want it, and it brings the language of the media and the moral framework of the media. And I think to a great extent, that's what the jokes were a reaction against. So these are really interesting. You can have the jokes about the Titanic, but unless you really find a joke tradition, a folk joking tradition, which is reflected against the press and not reported in the press, you've got a different phenomenon.
Yeah, I think I'm aware of that. This is the second level, just what got into the press, that it as evidence that it's there. Yeah. And I think also Hisalinde, refers to these as media disasters, not necessarily connecting them with television, And of course, it may be sort of more of a habit to think of it in terms of, my reading of Davies, associated with the visualization that comes with television, but if we see them as media disasters, yes, I mean, they've been there before. And concerning the sentimentalization, there is a very interesting point. When I was reading through the accounts of the disaster in the 1912 newspapers, I was struck by how, I'm not sure if sentimental or emotional and graphic the descriptions of the scenes were, And stylistically it's also interesting because very often they switch from the past description of the reporter into the historical present, to describe what is happening, A woman throws her child into the boat, never to see him again, right? And it's being dragged from, and you get all this, if this is sentimentalized reporting of these events, this is what you don't find later on after the war.
That was perfectly acceptable.
Yes.
But it would still be interesting to go back and maybe not focus purely on disaster, to see whether there were any folk joking traditions that were in some respect reactive to media presentation, whether it was disaster or not. And maybe in the political arenas where you're going to find it first. But that kind of thing, that kind of dynamic of the folk reacting against the media construction.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a comment regarding the forms of jokes which you recorded, which are not that conventional compared to what the joke is right now for us. Not like a narrative joke with a punchline. But as Eliot writes also, narrative joke is a rather recent thing. So at the beginning of the 20th century, it wasn't quite a phenomenon. So maybe it's not that the disaster jokes were not there. It's maybe that they just had a different form. And also, of course, since the resources which you have, of course, you do not have any recordings about spontaneous conversational joking because, I'm sure you're safe and it wasn't.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I know he thought that the internet had changed everything, so I'm not sure to what extent he would be clinging to the television. But I know that with the death of Diana, England went collectively mad. I'll probably get shot by somebody British who would say that. But there was this reaction, and there were jokes on the internet. There were jokes that people were telling on buses and on trains and all over the place. That happened within hours. Now, when you told him about all this, what did he say?
Sorry?
When you told him about these things, you thought, I have a lovely vision of you sitting in a library reading all these things all night. What did he say?
Over lunch. He was sad for a while. He was thinking hard about what this means with respect, to his beloved Jaroslav Hašek, who I think sort of put a dagger into his back. I felt it at that moment,
That was a good well-placed dagger.
But he also said that this was an ordinary automobile accident, and look at what they did with it. You know, this was a person who hadn't figured into the lives of all these people, and they were responding as though they lost their sister or brother. So this, again, was a kind of reaction that, you know, that was likely to occur, because, and the media ran with it, of course, on that basis. You know, so that's where you're going to get pushback.
But
He loved it when people argued with him. So he used to tell his students, argue with me and win, and you'll win first.
yeah, I mean, the material is there in the news reports. You know, the over emotional coverage, and of course you have the yellow press, which had been like that since the 17th century, on the visual side as well as the verbal side. Yep.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's really very interesting, and I will see if we can find a way to take up your challenge to find another example of the Dutch, because we are more obsessed with seats and boats than what you guys are. But I have 2 points. So one, I think it makes more sense to think of disaster jokes to be connected to something that has been theorized in media studies as media events. So very specific form when something becomes really sort of big and thematized as something large and very important. I think there is a body of work on that, and I think it helps to think. The second point, and I would like to hear what you think about this. So apart from the obvious sentimentality involved in reporting and the strange mix of emotions, there is also in many cycles of disaster jokes, it has to do with hubris, with something really sort of audacious and a little over the top, and people sort of showing off. And there is a strong element, of course, both in the Challenger, it's definitely in 9/11, also, and this is also in the Titanic. I mean, they were saying sort of the biggest, safest ship ever that would rule the whole. So there was this narrative around it that probably also reached Bohemia. Of this is like the greatest event and the biggest and the most expensive and all of this. And I think that's also part of creating the media event, but also part of why there is this sort of clash or this specific way that makes it so poignant and so easy to joke about. Because this is really the mighty that have fallen in such a dramatic way. So isn't that also part of, or something that is often part of disaster jokes?
Well, thanks for the suggestion. Definitely it is. You know, it makes me think, you know, of socialist jokes, you know, that we heard about here. You know, we're building this wonderful society. Everything will be beautiful. You know, people will love each other. But then there is the painful reality. You know, so it's a similar setup. This ideal, perfect versus the fail.
But there was also that case of the Pennsylvania politician whose name I don't remember, who shot himself on television.
Okay. Yeah.
And there was a whole cycle of jokes about that. So it wasn't, you know, it's not really kind of a hubris kind of disaster that necessarily, I mean, it's there. But the Titanic, the towers, and what was the third one?
Chernobyl, was it?
The which?
Chernobyl? No?
No, the Challenger disaster.
Challenger, yeah. Okay.
But in coordination with what Linda is saying, they were also aestheticized images. So when you think of the Titanic, what do you think about? The ship going down, you know, was it bow first? Yeah, you know, bow first. When you think of the Challenger, it's a fireball in the sky. When you think of the two towers, it's a plane going into this upright thing. So they're almost really kind of, if somebody showed those in an art museum, nobody would object. You know?
2 quick points on that. I think it's really important what you've done, and it's always good to challenge theory, and Christie would love it. He would. Yeah. Going back to what he says about the falsifiability of his theory, he's chosen the wrong example. He talks about the vicar of Stiff. What on earth is it, a heard of the vicar of Stiff? fine, whatever, if the guy shoots himself. So you have chosen a much better example to test the theory.
I think his point is that vicar was the major, like, negative event of that time. You know, it was.
I don't think so. Not someone who's called a vicar. That's not important. Is there Archbishop of Canterbury? Maybe. But the second point I want to make is, sorry, it's another bit of Jessica promotion, self-promotion. The book that's coming out, Judges Judging Humour, has a chapter by Christie in which he connects jokes and anecdotes and how to translate formally between each other. And I recommend you have a look at that when it's published. It's another month or so before it's published, because I think there's been some criticism about the structure of what you're discovering and how they truly connect to folk circulation and so on. I think you may find the answer there in what Christie's last thinking was about. He's dealing there with, he is dealing there with the late 19th century anecdotes about legal wit and humour and disaster and how they translate and relate to jokes. And this is pre-television, it's pre-radio, it's print media only, and I think the theory of structure is talking about could be quite relevant.
Okay, thank you very much.
The last question was from Moira, maybe?
I guess again, it's more of a comment than a question. I echo what everyone else has said, but I'm so glad that it's really important, and I hope you continue it, and I hope it gets published. But I think here's another example where we need to step back and maybe define our terms a little. Not every joke that mentions a disaster is a disaster joke. I think the examples you found are not disaster jokes in the sense that we talk about when we talk about the joke cycles. You know, we've got an ethnic joke, we've got a satirical bite, a religious hypocrisy, we've got a joke against the media, but they're not disaster jokes in the same sense. And that may make a difference.
Yep, I agree with you, absolutely, yes. My point was to show that they exist. There is something out there, perhaps, that we need to grab a hold of.
Next task, Hindenburg.
Thank you.